Thanks for joining us today for Jennifer Schaus and Associates in our Webinar Wednesday program, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. We are uncovering each part of the DFARS, or Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern. As you know, the DFARS are the rulebooks for contracting with the Defense Department, and we have been moving sequentially. We started with DFARS Part 201 in January, and we will be finishing with Part 253 in December. Our webinars are every Wednesday and are provided complimentary. They are recorded and can be downloaded from our website and YouTube channel, which now holds over 450 of our government contracting webinars. In the interest of time, we do not take questions, so if you do have questions for our speaker, we will have her information on the last slide of the presentation today. And a special thanks to our educational sponsor, the National Veteran Small Business Coalition, for making these webinars possible. The NVSBC is the largest nonprofit trade association for veterans. Please visit their website for more information. Virginia PTAC at GMU offers free one-on-one counseling to firms in Virginia on federal, state, and local procurement topics. Online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on business location. If you are interested in learning more, please use the link provided to explore what PTAC can offer. Set Aside Alert provides up-to-date news, information, and opportunities for small business federal contractors. Their daily opportunities alerts assure you won't miss important sources, thought, and solicitation announcements, providing details so you can jump on the hot ones. Every 2 weeks, they deliver concise breaking news, events, regulations, and teaming opportunities. Please join the Reston Chamber of Commerce for their NOVA B2G Matchmaking Conference tomorrow, May 6th, for networking, matchmaking, and with primes and agencies, education, and an expo. Visit the website on your screen for more details. Federal contracting is a relationship game. Now get in front of your federal human sooner with the exclusive Players and Layers method from Judy Bratt and Summit Insight. Connect with her on LinkedIn and find out more, or visit growfedbiz.com today. If you are interested in selling to the federal government, you may need a contract vehicle. The most popular one is the GSA schedule. Learn more about the requirements, the proposal process, and how this contract vehicle may or may not be the right tool for you. Jennifer Schaus is teaching a series of classes, as you can see here, with the Virginia PTAC and Mary Washington University. All classes are listed on our website under the events section with the registration link. Okay, and now a little bit about us. We work with U.S. federal government contractors, including product, service, and software firms. Our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles and compliance. More information can be found on our website. We also have opportunities for your organization to advertise in our newsletter. We now reach over 23,000 subscribers, and this includes both contractors and government. Contact us for pricing information with the email shown on your screen. And I also wanted to inform you of a new series that we have this year. We have launched a monthly series called the GovCon Live Q&A Cafe. This is a live webinar series held each month, and these will take place on the second Friday of each month this year at 12 p.m. Eastern. We have assembled a group of 4 panelists who are subject matter experts on a specific federal contracting topic. The panelists will make a short presentation about the topics listed here on your screen, and then take your live questions about that topic. So, for example, our panelists covered team agreements last month, and next week, on May 14th, our panelists will be covering subcontracting. Our panelists include attorneys, consultants, and other industry professionals, and you can sign up on our website under the Q&A Cafe tab. Sponsorships are available. Please email hello@jenniferschaus.com for a media kit with pricing details. Also, please note that you can use code DFARS for a $15 discount on each of these webinars. Okay, and now to introduce our speaker, Tara Ward. Welcome, Tara. We are glad to have you here with us today, and I'll now turn the floor over to you.
Great, thank you so much, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are joining us from. My name is Tara Ward. I am a partner in the Government Contracts Group at Wiley Ryan here in DC. I'll just note that I do have a pretty diverse practice. I do litigation, I do bid protests and contract claims, but also a heavy diet of counseling, especially for small businesses. I've got a number of veteran-owned and service-disabled veteran-owned small business clients, as well as some emerging tech companies that are in the throes of getting into the federal marketplace. So I've been working a lot with them on some counseling matters. I mentioned that just as an aside because I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I really respect and like these programs put on by Jay Schaus and Associates, in part because of the discipline that's involved in giving some attention to each specific provision in the DFARS, as well as other agency supplements to the FAR, but also because I have certainly found that attention to detail in some of the perhaps less flashy, less litigation-focused provisions of the various supplements can really give contractors the edge as they break into the marketplace, and certainly is always a great refresher for folks from the government to spend time with provisions that talk about what they can and they can't do. So with that, I'll start talking about perhaps the agenda on the next slide, please. I think we might need one more slide to get to the agenda. Great. So today we're going to talk about DFARS Part 218, but just to provide a little bit of context first, as you all likely know, DFARS Part 218 supplements FAR Part 18, which in turn outlines techniques and procedures for streamlining standard acquisition processes. On the DFARS side, of course, we're talking about DoD acquisitions specifically. And so we're going to talk today about specific examples of available flexibilities. That's DFARS Subpart 218.1, and then we'll move to 218.2, which covers emergency acquisition flexibilities. Next slide, please. So first things first, no discussion of Part 218 of the DFARS can really get off the ground without understanding where we are in FAR Part 18. Understanding, of course, that this webinar is not about FAR Part 18, it's about DFARS, but it is really good practice to appreciate where you are in DFARS by looking back to the FAR. So FAR Part 18 describes acquisition flexibilities available for emergency acquisitions, including just generally available flexibilities, as well as emergency acquisition flexibilities. So that sort of one-two punch is in both FAR Part 18 and then mirrored in DFARS 218. There are some limitations set forth in FAR Part 18. First, as you would likely expect, where there are flexible approaches described in FAR Part 18 and DFARS 218, there are certain conditions that must be met. These aren't flexibilities that are necessarily available on any procurement, but rather they're meant for specific emergency type acquisitions, and we'll get into that in the coming slides. Another limitation is that these flexibilities are not exempt from the requirements and limitations in FAR Part 3, most notably improper business practices and personal conflicts of interest. So it's not as though we are talking about ways around those particular requirements. Those requirements stand. We're just identifying some flexibilities in acquisition techniques. And as you'll see there, as a really perhaps perfect segue, the FAR specifically leaves room for agency supplements on this particular topic. Specifically, FAR 18.000 says additional flexibilities may be authorized in an executive agency supplement to the FAR. So as we proceed through subparts 218.1 and 218.2, we will be looking back to the FAR to give us some grounding. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving right along into DFARS subpart 218.1, available acquisition flexibilities. So here we are supplementing FAR 18.101 to identify acquisition flexibilities that are available in certain circumstances. So there are 26 outlined in the FAR, and the DFARS provides 11 additional flexibilities. As tempting as it was for me to give you the full context by walking through all the 26 in the FAR, again, I appreciate this is not a FAR Part 18 presentation, so we'll focus on the DFARS. I've listed them all out here, and as you can see, they run quite the gamut. There are flexibilities related to other than full and open competition, storage and disposal of toxic waste, tax exemptions in Spain, and all the way down to mortuary services. We are going to focus on 4 specific flexibilities today, but certainly I would suggest that everyone take a turn through all of them. Again, as I mentioned at the outset, it's a great discipline and a refresher to look through all the provisions methodically. Next slide, please. The first specific flexibility I want to talk about today is the first in the list, and that is subsection A, circumstances permitting other than full and open competition. Under this provision of the DFARS, we look to FAR 6.302-2, which provides agencies authority to use something other than full and open competition in unusual and compelling urgency type situations. The FAR provides a pretty high level description of when unusual and compelling urgency might be found to apply, but in the DFARS, we have some additional information about when this authority can be used. In the FAR, we have just very high level, you might use something other than full and open competition in urgent and compelling cases, okay? Or where a delay in award might cause some harm to the government. Here, by citing PGI 206, we have a little additional guidance in the DFARS about when contracting officers can use other than full and open competition. Those include, as you can see here from the PGI provision that's excerpted, when, for example, supplies, services, or construction might be needed at once, immediately, now, yesterday, because of fire, flood, explosion, or other disasters. Similarly, the government might need essential equipment or repair to comply with orders for a ship or ensure and support an operational mission. And the list goes on, as you can see here. Next slide, please. The next specific flexibility I thought I would mention today is found in paragraph E of this particular provision, and that's the spare parts breakout program. The DFARS says that an urgent, immediate buy need not be delayed if an evaluation of the additional information cannot be completed in time to meet the required delivery date. Okay, great, but what does that mean? It might help to back up here and give a little more context about the spare parts breakout program writ large. So as you can see here, the DoD spare parts breakout program seeks to reduce costs through the use of competitive procurement methods or simply the direct purchase of parts from an actual manufacturer, but still maintaining the integrity of the systems and equipment that the parts are meant to be used in. So with that program, there are procedures for screening and coding parts to give contracting officers summary information about technical data, sources of supply, et cetera. That helps the contracting officer make various decisions about the method of contracting, sources of supply, and other issues critical to the acquisition management and planning stage. So back to this context, DFARS 218.170 says that an urgent buy need not be delayed by this sort of information gathering if it's going to delay the procurement. I just thought I would mention that because there has been some focus on supply chain spare parts in recent years. So this is just a flexibility that is might be of interest. Next slide, please. Okay, another flexibility that's worth mentioning, I think, is outlined in paragraph G of this provision. That's Authorization Acts, Appropriations Acts, and other statutory restrictions on foreign acquisition. Here, the DFARS exempts certain acquisitions from the restrictions of 225.7002, which implements the Berry Amendment. So you can see here a number of different types of acquisitions that are not going to be subject to these restrictions related to food, clothing, fabrics, specialty metals, and hand or measuring tools. And I thought this was worth mentioning because, you know, this capability exists, and it's important to know that. But it's also something that you might keep in mind as we, the procurement field, continue to watch updates or changes in domestic source requirements, whether they be in the Buy American sphere, where we've certainly seen a lot of activity from the Trump and Biden administrations, or, you know, certainly if any changes come about to the Berry Amendment requirements, this might just be something to keep in mind. It's something that might be affected and might not be affected, but that's the reason I selected this particular provision for to highlight today. Next slide, please. All right, and the last specific flexibility in 218.170, this is the fourth that I wanted to highlight out of the 11 that I mentioned at the outset, is a provision related to rights and technical data. As you can see here, an agency head may notify a person that's asserting a restriction that urgent or compelling circumstances, for example, emergency repair or overhaul, do not permit the government to continue to respect the asserted restriction. Now, this is an interesting one. Data rights tends to be a hot issue, something that's, I think, increasingly important in especially high-tech procurements. But there are, I should note that there are some similar parallel flexibilities found in the data rights provisions related to challenges. Specifically, as you might know, the government is supposed to honor markings, restricted markings, pending resolution of challenges, but that may not be the case if there are urgent and compelling circumstances that or emergency circumstances where the government needs to act not in accordance with markings. So we have seen some activity in the challenge sphere where those types of urgent and compelling reasonings are used to get around markings. This particular provision, I personally and I think a number of my colleagues have not actually seen invoked. But, you know, it certainly does exist, as you can see here, and, you know, it does at least evoke some of the challenge provision flexibilities that the government might have. Okay, next slide, please. All right, with that, we will move on to DFARS subpart 218.2, emergency acquisition flexibilities. So just to give us some foundation as to what we're talking about here, emergency acquisition flexibilities are defined in FAR Part 18 as flexibilities that may be used in certain circumstances, and those are enumerated below, and we'll talk about them. The first is in support of a contingency operation. The second is to facilitate defense or recovery from cyber and other attacks against the United States. The third is in support of a request from the Secretary of State or USAID to facilitate international disaster assistance. And the fourth, as you might expect, is when the President issues an emergency declaration or a major disaster declaration. So those are the circumstances we're talking about today. On the one hand, I just briefly back to paragraph B there. To facilitate the defense against a recovery from nuclear, biological, chemical, radiological attack, those all sound sort of end of days-ish. But the cyber attack seems to be one of the most hot, concerning types of attacks these days. So I just wanted to highlight that these provisions, while you might not think that they are going to be necessary or used that often, hopefully we're not on the receiving end of a nuclear attack anytime soon. Certainly cyber attacks are becoming much more, unfortunately, common and concerning to the United States. Next slide, please. Okay, so contingency operation. The DFARS provision at 218.201 outlines some flexibilities available in contingency operations, but it is, of course, helpful to understand how the FAR defines a contingency operation in the first instance. So I've excerpted the definition here. Contingency operation is a military operation designated as one where the armed forces are or may become involved in military actions. Or it might be a military operation resulting in the call to active duty of members of these uniformed services. So DFARS 218.201 supplements FAR 18.201. And FAR 18.201, you can see this, any presentation on DFARS is going to be a sort of pull the thread and follow the leader all the way back to the FAR. FAR 18.201 largely increases micro-purchase and simplified acquisition thresholds in contingency operation acquisitions. The DFARS version, though, outlines 12 additional flexibilities, and we'll talk about those in a moment. But as you'll see, some of them echo the flexibilities enumerated in section 218.170. So hopefully you'll start to see some familiar flexibilities now having gone through subpart 101, or subpart 218.1. Next slide, please. All right, so what are these flexibilities that I just mentioned? The DFARS provision eliminates or at least softens requirements in the context listed there for you in this slide. These run all the way from selection, appointment, and termination of appointments provisions to electronic submission of payment requests. A couple of notes on a few of these just to give a little color. The first provision there, selection, appointment, and termination of appointment, that's an interesting one. The contracting officer qualification requirements are relaxed in contingency operations. So something like a baccalaureate degree requirement is not going to be applicable if you've got contracting personnel that we need to, the government needs to staff up with in a contingency operation. The third and fourth provisions there, use of government-wide commercial purchase cards. These provisions together seem to try to facilitate their use, make it easier and not a burden on DoD. So paragraph 3 there, the government-wide commercial purchase card doesn't have to be used in certain circumstances overseas. So if that's going to be a problem, the government doesn't necessarily need to use that where it otherwise might. But then in paragraph 4, there's sort of increased use if necessary. So the government-wide commercial purchase card can be used over the micro-purchase threshold, but at least under the simplified acquisition threshold in certain circumstances. So I like that sort of another 1-2 punch of trying to facilitate the use where it makes sense and where it actually helps and promotes the contingency operation. The 10th paragraph caught my eye, prohibited sources as well. DoD is authorized to make emergency acquisitions in direct support of certain operations in countries or regions that are subject to economic sanctions. And again, just if you step back from a lot of these provisions to the 30,000-foot policy level, a lot of these make sense. We want the DoD to be able to procure supplies and services in emergency circumstances easier. We want them to be able to do so wherever they are. We don't want to be hamstring them. That's probably not the right term. We don't want to restrict what they can and can't do in a manner that would undercut the government's mission. Okay, next slide, please. All right, moving on to DFARS 218.202, defense or recovery from certain events. Here we are again talking about defense again, for recovery from cyber attacks, as well as nuclear, biological, chemical, radiological attacks. The FAR provision in 18202, again, largely just increases micro-purchase and simplified acquisition thresholds, but the DFARS adds a few additional exemptions from requirements that you'll see below. So no unique item identification requirements, only one offer requirements are slightly different, and then there's some flexibility in how determination and findings are the approval process for those. Next slide, please. All right, in DFARS 218.203, we're talking about incidents of national significance, emergency declarations, and major disaster declarations. As you might expect, we'll look briefly to FAR 18.203. That provision of the FAR gives preference to local organizations, firms, and individuals when contracting for major disaster or emergency assistance activities. So what does that mean? These preferences are given or achieved using set-aside procurements or in some sort of evaluation preference. That's all provided for in 18203. The DFARS adds additional flexibilities in these types of circumstances where to sort of streamline determination and findings requirements when the government is excluding a particular source to establish or maintain an alternative source or sources. There's a lot of sort of policy behind those specific provisions, but to make a very long story short, the DFARS here is really trying to streamline what DoD can do in these types of situations. Okay, next slide, please. All right, DFARS 218.204, humanitarian or peacekeeping operations. Always helpful, again, to go back to our definitions, where FAR 2101 defines that type of operation, a humanitarian or peacekeeping operation, that is, as a military operation in support of the provision of humanitarian or foreign disaster assistance or in support of a peacekeeping operation. These do not include routine training, force rotation, or stationing. As you hopefully expect, 218.204 supplements FAR 18204, which again is threshold focused in increasing the simplified acquisition threshold. The DFARS here, though, renders inapplicable additional requirements. And there's a typo here. This is related to the humanitarian and peacekeeping operations. Apologies. There are going to be some other flexibilities here as well. And these do mirror the requirements that are inapplicable, as you can see here in the earlier provision related to cyber attacks. Apologies, this is a typo, 100% my fault. This third bullet should say DFARS provision renders inapplicable several requirements in these types of operations, i.e. humanitarian or peacekeeping operations. And they do echo the inapplicable requirements for responses to attacks. So again, we have the policy related to unique item identification. We have only one offer requirements, and we have the different approach to approvals of DNS for time and materials and labor hour contracts. Next slide, please. All right, the last two slides we have here are sort of, I fondly call them sort of cats and dogs of this particular part. 218.270, this is largely sort of a paperwork, administration, consistency effort for our purposes, but this provision just replaces head of the agency with head of the contracting activity in certain FAR provisions where the head of the agency is used. And you can see those listed out there for you. Next slide, please. The last provision in 218.271 that we'll talk about today is the use of electronic business tools. The DFARS sort of punts over to PGI 218 regarding the use of electronic business tools in contingency operations or humanitarian or peacekeeping operations. If you haven't spent time with 218.271, I strongly suggest you do so. It's of interest to me, at least because it gets quickly down into the weeds of a couple of different electronic business tools. For example, it outlines the 3-in-1 tool, which automates field code receipt and purchase processes that would ordinarily be done using standard form 44. And then it also talks about acquisition cross-servicing agreements, ACSAs, and how the tracking and reporting system that provides visibility into those agreements. So again, just sort of these last two slides are the last two subsections of DFARS 218 that provide additional sort of flexibilities or approaches to, well, this one in particular, flexibilities approaches to use in contingency operations or these peacekeeping missions. I just want to make add a concluding thought, because this is the end of the substantive part of our presentation, our foray into DFARS Part 218. I just want to again echo, I think what I said at the outset, which is I highly recommend to all. Clearly, you are signed up for this course, so you believe in it as well. But spending time with each part and subpart of the DFARS and other agency supplements, as well as the FAR itself, is a great and very, very important and helpful activity. I want to spend some time with here in 2021. I think the discussion of flexibilities that are already available to defense agencies or are available in emergency situations such as cybersecurity attacks, which are becoming, a very big concern. It's a really interesting conversation to have, the flexibilities available to contracting agencies at a time when a lot of folks in procurement are thinking about promoting OT, other transaction agreements. I know Jay Schaus and Associates has some great programming on OTs, but just flexibility seems to be a word of the day when talking about different acquisition techniques and methods. So always good to ground yourselves in what is already available under the FAR and DFARS-based procurements, of course. And also, some of this struck me as particularly interesting in light of the fast-paced acquisition of the vaccines in the last year. So I have not been involved in or had that much detailed insight into the specific process, other than some background understanding of how the fairness and reasonableness determinations were made. But certainly the fast pace of acquiring and distributing vaccines in the COVID pandemic, I think underscores some of the importance of having emergency acquisition flexibilities, whether in the FARS, DFARS, or other supplements or OT. So anyway, I leave you with those parting thoughts. That's the end of my presentation. I guess I will throw it back over to our host. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Tara, for a great presentation and sharing your time with us today. And feel free to reach out to her if you have any questions using the information that's on your screen now. And thank you to everyone who joined us for this webinar. The recording will be on our website and YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. And please join us next week as we cover more parts of the DFARS.
Thank you.